Nobody likes inheritance tax, but until now, farmers haven't had to worry about it. That's because they've enjoyed 100% tax relief under two categories.
Do these people not understand where food comes from in this country?
The industry is on its knees.
This is blood, sweat and tears. Those weren't just words spoken at the NFU conference. They were the raw emotion of British farmers watching their life's work being threatened by Labour's inheritance tax raid. As Environment Secretary Steve Reed stood before a crowd of stone-faced farmers, he quickly realised this wasn't going to be another polished political speech. The footage you're about to see captures the moment when generational farmers confronted the man whose party plans to strip away their family legacies. And his uncomfortable reaction says everything.
And it also means that the farmer then can't borrow against his assets or apply for certain environmental schemes.
Agricultural property relief covering land and farm buildings, and business property relief that covers crops, livestock, machinery, farm shops. And
before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favour. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now back to the video.
BBC thinks you should be paying for everything. Okay, do you know how many people pay inheritance tax in this country?
It's 4% of estates.
What?
Really able to give an answer as to when people would start feeling better off under Labour, and how exactly the kind of long-term promises.
What happens when politicians who've never worked the land make decisions that destroy generations of farming heritage? That's the question that hung in the air at the NFU conference, where the atmosphere was thick with betrayal and disbelief. On October 30th, Labour dropped a bombshell on Britain's farming communities, without warning, announcing the scrapping of agricultural property relief from inheritance tax.
The problem, if you're the Treasury, is 100% relief attracts people who want to shelter their wealth, and that's affected who's buying farms. This chart.
I went into the budget feeling quite optimistic, but came out feeling completely winded. I thought that this budget was going to be about helping work.
This wasn't just another policy tweak, it was an existential threat to family farms across the nation. Let's talk about what this actually means for the people who feed our country. Farming families now face potential inheritance tax bills of up to 40% on their agricultural assets. For most farms, this isn't just taking a chunk of profit, it's a death sentence for their way of life. These aren't wealthy tax dodgers with offshore accounts. These are hard-working families whose entire livelihood and heritage is tied up in the land they work. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of this policy is the April 2026 implementation deadline. Can you imagine the psychological torture this creates?
And that's the Welsh Government's proposed new post-Brexit system of public payments for farmers.
Protesters here. Farmers say this is just the start. Next week, they are planning to hold their first ever strike action.
Elderly farmers now face an unthinkable moral calculation. Should they die before the deadline to save their family's legacy? This isn't hypothetical. NFU President Tom Bradshaw shared the heartbreaking story of a 94-year-old farmer now wondering if he should pass away before the deadline to protect generations of family work. The fundamental problem is that farms operate on incredibly thin profit margins. Their assets aren't liquid cash sitting in bank accounts. They're tied up in the land, buildings and machinery necessary to produce our food. When the tax bill comes, there's simply no way to pay it without selling parts of the farm itself, destroying its viability.
One way to avoid inheritance tax is to hand down your assets 7 years before you die. The problem with that, of course, is that no one knows exactly when that's going to be.
It was bought by actual farmers. The rest is going to lifestyle farmers, think Jeremy Clarkson, private investors and institutional.
What makes this betrayal cut even deeper is how directly it contradicts Labour's pre-election promises. Keir Starmer stood before these same farmers, looking them in the eye, and assured them he would protect their interests. Now those words ring hollow across Britain's countryside, just months after taking power. This couldn't come at a worse time for farming communities already buckling under severe mental health pressures. Financial uncertainty, extreme weather, and crushing regulatory burdens had already pushed many farmers to the breaking point. And now this. This isn't just about money or taxation. This is about the destruction of a way of life that has sustained our nation for generations.
Investors. Now, the government says sheltering wealth this way is unfair and unsustainable, so they're changing the rules. Instead of 100%
of some of the most valuable farms, the majority will still not be affected by them.
It's about rural communities that will collapse when these farms are broken up. It's about our national food security being sacrificed on the altar of short-term political calculations. As rural Britain's way of life hangs in the balance, one politician was about to discover what happens when carefully crafted speeches meet raw, unfiltered fury. The usual polite applause that greets ministers at these events was nowhere to be found. Instead, Steve Reid faced a wall of stony silence as he took the stage at the NFU conference. The message was clear before he'd uttered a single word. These people weren't here for political theatre. You could almost feel sorry for Reid if you didn't know the damage his government had inflicted. His body language told the whole story. Nervous adjustments, a smile that never quite reached his eyes, the subtle shifting of weight that betrays a man who knows he's walking into hostile territory. This wasn't the comfortable Westminster bubble where politicians can hide behind procedure and rhetoric. The confrontation reached its peak when Reid finally addressed the elephant in the room. "I can't give the answer I know many of you want on inheritance tax," he admitted, words landing like stones in still water.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets.
There are things that we can do better as farmers.
By a fog of despair over what's been foisted upon them, I beg of the government.
Across the audience, heads shook in disgust. These weren't just disgruntled voters. These were people watching their family legacies being dismantled by politicians who'd never worked a day on the land. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Reid stood there with his manicured political language, speaking of understanding the strength of feeling in the room, while offering nothing of substance. Meanwhile, sitting before him were men and women who'd just heard heart-wrenching stories of elderly farmers facing impossible decisions. No amount of political spin could bridge that divide. When farmers began visibly protesting during his speech, Reid's discomfort reached new heights. "We can see an example of that right in front of me now," he acknowledged awkwardly, a moment of unscripted reality breaking through the practiced facade. It was a rare glimpse of a politician forced to confront the human cost of his party's policies in real time.
And still more generously treated, actually, than farms used to be in decades past. The changes will affect actually a remarkable...
Every individual farmer will have £1 million of inheritance tax relief. That rises to £1.5 million once you add the normal personal reliefs that...
Perhaps most revealing was Reid's choice of words when attempting to address the inheritance tax issue. "I am sorry it's a decision that we've had to take," he said. The classic passive construction of a politician unwilling to own the consequences of his actions. Not "I'm sorry for the decision we made," but a decision we've had to take, as though some invisible force had compelled Labour to target family farms. What we've witnessed today goes beyond a mere confrontation over tax policy. It reveals the cavernous disconnect between Westminster's political calculations and the survival of British agriculture itself. These inheritance tax changes aren't just financial obstacles. They threaten to dismantle family farms that form the backbone of our national food security.
See any further tax taken from them. That was really important, but we also set out as priorities, we are going to invest in our National Health Service.
The changes that we've made, I say, the door is open and you can leave.
Once these multi-generational operations disappear, they simply won't come back. The historical record shows us something powerful, though. When ordinary people unite around a genuine injustice, governments can be forced to reconsider even their most firmly entrenched policies. These farmers who confronted Steve Reid today aren't just fighting for their livelihoods, they're standing for everyone who believes politicians should be held to their word. What happens next depends not on parliamentary debates or ministerial speeches, but on whether enough British citizens recognise what's at stake in our rural communities and demand accountability. The future of British farming, and with it our food sovereignty, now hangs in the balance.